Have you ever felt so utterly alone, so broken by the world, that even the thought of another sunrise felt like a burden? What if, in that moment of absolute desolation, a hand reached out, not in pity, but in a quiet understanding that mirrored your own scarred soul? This is a story for anyone who has ever known the sting of loss, the chill of isolation, and the unexpected warmth of a connection forged in the crucible of hardship. Stick around, because the journey of a man named Jedediah and a woman he found near death on a forgotten trail is one that speaks to the resilient heart in all of us. It began, as so many desperate tales do, under the merciless eye of a prairie sun, with the buzzards already circling. Jedediah Thorne knew the language of the high plains better than he knew most men. He understood the sigh of the wind through the parched grass, the distant yelp of a coyote, the silent, patient waiting of the buzzards. It was this last that drew his eye from the faint, shimmering line of the horizon. They circled low, with a lazy confidence that spoke of something already fallen, something likely beyond help. He was a man who generally kept to his own path, a solitary line etched across the vast canvas of the West, but something in their patient descent tugged at a well-buried instinct. He nudged his horse, Bess, a creature as weathered and stoic as he, towards the grim congregation. The dust swirled around Bess's hooves as they approached, the air thick with the scent of dry earth and something else, something metallic and unsettling. He saw her then, a crumpled heap of faded calico against the ochre dirt. Her dark hair was splayed out, matted with dust and what looked like dried blood. One arm was flung wide, the other curled protectively towards her abdomen. For a moment, Jedediah thought he was too late, another tragedy swallowed by the unforgiving land. He dismounted, his movements slow and deliberate, his rifle held loosely in one hand more from habit than immediate perceived threat. The buzzards flapped, annoyed at the interruption, and settled on a nearby, skeletal cottonwood, their bald heads turned towards him with unblinking scrutiny. He knelt beside her, his shadow falling over her still form. Her face was pale beneath the grime, etched with lines of pain and exhaustion that seemed too deep for her apparent youth. A long, ugly gash marred her temple, caked with dried blood and dirt. Her breathing was shallow, a mere flutter against the stillness of the air. He wasn't a man prone to softness, life had scoured most of that from him, but the sheer vulnerability of her, lying there like a broken doll, stirred something within him. He remembered his own wife, Martha, lost to the fever years ago, how small and fragile she'd seemed at the end. This woman was a stranger, yet her plight resonated with that old, familiar ache of helplessness. With a sigh that seemed to carry the weight of the entire prairie, Jedediah gently brushed a strand of hair from her face. Her eyelids flickered. A low moan, a sound like a wounded animal, escaped her lips. He saw the terror in her eyes as they struggled to focus on him, a big, rough-looking man looming over her. "Easy now," he said, his voice raspy from disuse. "Ain't gonna hurt you." He wasn't sure if she understood, or even truly heard him. His gaze fell to the dark stain spreading across the fabric of her dress near her hip. Another wound, then. Deeper, perhaps. This was bad. Very bad. He knew he couldn't leave her. The buzzards were a patient jury, and their verdict was already cast. He had a small, barely their homestead a half-day's ride away, if he pushed it. It wasn't much, a sod-roofed cabin more whole than home, but it offered shelter, and he had a little water and fewer supplies. It would have to do. He carefully, methodically, checked her for other injuries, his touch surprisingly gentle for hands more accustomed to reins and rifle stocks. The wound on her hip was a bullet graze, nasty but not immediately life-threatening if it didn't fester. The head wound was more worrying. She flinched when he touched the gash on her temple, a small, sharp intake of breath. Her eyes, a deep, haunted brown, locked onto his for a fleeting moment, a spark of awareness in the depths of her pain. "Who?" she whispered, her voice a dry crackle. "Name's Jedediah," he replied, his tone even. "Found you out here. Looks like you've had some trouble." An understatement of monumental proportions, he thought wryly. He had to get her moving, but she was in no condition to ride. He scanned the desolate landscape. No help there. It was just him, her, and the waiting sky. He made his decision. He had a spare blanket in his saddle roll. He'd fashion a travois, crude but effective enough to drag her behind Bess. It would be slow, agonizing for her probably, but better than the alternative. He rose, his joints protesting. "Gonna get you somewhere safe," he said, more to himself than to her. He didn't expect a response, and he didn't get one. Her eyes had slipped closed again, her face a mask of suffering. The sun climbed higher, beating down with relentless ferocity as Jedediah worked. He found 2 sturdy, albeit scrawny, saplings near a dried-up creek bed and, using his knife and some rawhide strips, constructed a makeshift drag. He spread his blanket over it, trying to create some semblance of padding. Lifting her was a struggle. She was light, too light, but dead weight nonetheless. He managed to settle her onto the travois, her head lolling despite his attempt to cushion it with his jacket. He tied her as securely as he could, wincing at the thought of the jolting journey ahead. He spoke to Bess, his voice a low murmur. "Easy, girl." Slow and steady, the mare, bless her steady heart, seemed to understand, her ears flicking back and forth. And so, they began their slow, arduous trek, a solitary man, a wounded woman, and a patient horse, inching their way across a landscape that offered no charity, only a stark, brutal beauty. The buzzards, cheated for now, followed at a distance, a persistent, ominous shadow. Jedediah didn't look back at them. He just kept his eyes on the faint track ahead, his jaw set, a grim determination hardening his weathered features. He'd made a choice, and Jedediah Thorne was a man who saw his choices through, no matter the cost. The prairie wind whispered around them, carrying the scent of dust, despair, and a tiny, almost imperceptible, flicker of something that might, one day, be called hope. The journey to Jedediah's cabin was a blur of jolting pain and fragmented consciousness for the woman. She drifted in and out, aware only of the relentless sun, the agonizing drag of her body over uneven ground, and the looming, silent presence of the men who had found her. Each bump, each lurch, sent fresh waves of agony through her hip and head. Sometimes, through the haze, she'd see his broad back, the steady rhythm of his shoulders as he led the horse. He never spoke, not to her anyway, though she occasionally heard his low, rumbling tones directed at the animal. Fear was a constant companion, a cold knot in her stomach. Who was this man? What did he want? But exhaustion and pain always dragged her back under before the questions could fully form. They reached the cabin as the sun began to bleed across the western sky, painting the clouds in hues of bruised purple and fiery orange. It was, as Jedediah had acknowledged to himself, more hovel than home. Dug into the side of a low hill, with a roof of thick prairie sod, it blended almost seamlessly with the landscape. A thin curl of smoke bespoke a recently lit fire, a promise of meager warmth against the coming night chill. Jedediah halted Bess, his body aching with a weariness that matched the woman's. He'd been pushing himself, and the horse, hard. He unstrapped her from the travois with the same careful hands he'd used to build it. Lifting her again, he was struck anew by her lightness. He carried her inside the cabin. It was small, a single room, sparsely furnished with a rough-hewn table, 2 stools, and a narrow cot in the corner. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, the source of the welcome smoke. The air inside was cool and smelled of earth, wood smoke, and something vaguely medicinal, the herbs he sometimes gathered. He laid her gently on the cot, the only soft place in the entire dwelling. She whimpered, her eyes still closed. He needed to tend to her wounds properly. He built up the fire, the flickering light casting dancing shadows on the packed earth walls. He found a relatively clean strip of linen, part of an old shirt, and dampened it with water from his canteen. Kneeling beside the cot, he began to clean the gash on her temple. She flinched, her breath hissing through her teeth, but she didn't cry out. He admired that, a small spark of respect igniting within him. This woman, whoever she was, had grit. "Got to clean this," he said, his voice still gruff, but a fraction softer than before. "Might sting some," he worked with a focused intensity, his brow furrowed. The bullet graze on her hip was ugly, inflamed, but he'd seen worse. He cleaned it as best he could, then applied a poultice of crushed yarrow leaves, a trick he'd learned from an old trapper years ago. It was said to draw out infection and help staunch bleeding. He bound the wounds with more strips of linen. Throughout his ministrations, she remained mostly silent, though he saw the clench of her jaw, the tightening of her hands into fists. When he was done, he straightened up, his back cracking in protest. He looked down at her. Her face, even pale and bruised, had a delicate strength to it. Dark lashes lay against cheekbones that were too prominent. What storm had cast her onto this desolate shore? He busied himself making a thin broth from some dried rabbit meat and a few wild onions. The aroma, meager as it was, filled the small cabin. When it was ready, he ladled some into a chipped enamel cup. He went back to the cot. Her eyes were open now, watching him with a mixture of fear and weariness. "You need to eat something," he said, holding out the cup. She stared at it, then at him. He saw the hesitation, the mistrust. He couldn't blame her. "It's just rabbit broth. Won't poison you." A faint, almost imperceptible smile touched his lips, a rare occurrence. She struggled to sit up, wincing. He moved to help her, propping her against the wall with his folded jacket behind her back. Her hands trembled as she reached for the cup. He steadied it for her. She took a small, tentative sip. Then another. The warmth seemed to seep into her, chasing away some of the deep chill that had settled in her bones. They sat in silence for a while as she slowly finished the broth. The only sounds were the crackle of the fire and the distant howl of a lone coyote, a mournful sound that echoed the desolation outside. Finally, she spoke, her voice weak but clearer than before. "Thank you." Jedediah nodded, uncomfortable with gratitude. "Just did what needed doing." He took the empty cup from her. "You need to rest. Got a long way to healing." Where am I?" she asked, her gaze sweeping the small, dim interior of the cabin. "My place," he said simply. "Not much, but it's safe for now." He paused. "What's your name, miss?" She hesitated for a long moment, her eyes clouding over with something he couldn't quite decipher, fear, perhaps, or a deeper sorrow. "Eliza," she finally whispered. "Eliza Carter." "Jedediah Thorne," he repeated, as if sealing an unspoken agreement. He saw the exhaustion pulling at her, the way her eyelids drooped. "Get some sleep, Eliza. We can talk more in the morning, if you're up to it." He moved to the other side of the small room, banking the fire for the night. He would sleep on the floor near the hearth, his saddle for a pillow. It wasn't the first time, and likely wouldn't be the last. As Eliza drifted into an uneasy sleep, haunted by fragmented memories of horses, shouts, and a blinding pain, Jedediah sat staring into the dying embers. Eliza Carter. The name meant nothing to him. But her presence here, in his isolated world, meant everything had changed. He was no longer just a solitary man making his way. He was a protector, a guardian, however reluctantly. He felt the weight of that responsibility settle upon him, as familiar and uncomfortable as his worn leather vest. The prairie night deepened around the small cabin, a vast, silent wilderness holding its breath. And inside, two strangers, thrown together by fate and violence, began a journey whose destination neither could yet imagine. The next few days passed in a slow rhythm of healing and quiet observation. Eliza slept much of the time, her body fiercely battling the trauma it had endured. Jedediah moved about his small domain with a quiet efficiency that Eliza, in her waking moments, found both reassuring and unsettling. He was a man of few words, his pronouncements practical and to the point. He'd tend the fire, check her wounds with a surprisingly gentle touch that belied his rough exterior, and prepare meager meals of broth, dried meat, or whatever small game he managed to snare. He never pressed her for information, never asked about the circumstances that had left her for dead on the trail. His silence was a heavy blanket, but it was not unkind. Eliza, for her part, watched him. She saw the way his weathered hands, calloused and scarred, moved with a sureness whether he was whittling a piece of wood or stirring a pot. She saw the lines etched around his eyes, testament to countless hours squinting into the sun or peering into the darkness. There was a deep sadness in those eyes, she thought, a loneliness that mirrored her own, though its source remained a mystery. Her fear of him slowly began to recede, replaced by a tentative curiosity, and a growing sense of gratitude that warred with her ingrained caution. She was alive because of him. That was a truth she couldn't ignore. One afternoon, as the sun cast long shadows across the cabin floor, Eliza felt strong enough to sit up on her own for more than a few minutes. Jedediah was outside, chopping wood, the rhythmic thud of the axe a steady counterpoint to the whisper of the wind. She looked around the small cabin, truly seeing it for the first time. It was stark, basic, yet meticulously clean. A few well-worn books sat on a makeshift shelf, their titles too faded to read from this distance. A rifle and a shotgun were propped neatly in a corner. This was the home of a man who lived on the edge, prepared for anything, expecting nothing. He came back inside, his arms laden with firewood, kicking the door shut with his boot. He stopped when he saw her sitting up, a flicker of surprise in his eyes. Feeling better, then? He asked, his voice its usual low rumble. A little, Eliza admitted. Her voice was still weak, but steadier. Thank you. For everything. He merely grunted, dumping the wood by the hearth. Needed doin', he repeated, his standard reply to any expression of thanks. He busied himself for a moment, then turned back to her. Hungry? She nodded. Yes, it was the first time she'd felt genuine hunger in days. He prepared a slightly thicker stew this time, with a few precious potatoes he'd clearly been saving. As they ate, an awkward silence stretched between them, punctuated only by the clinking of spoons against their wooden bowls. Finally, Eliza broke it. Mr. Thorne. Jedediah, he looked up, his gaze questioning. Why did you help me? The question had been hovering in her mind, unspoken, 4 days. He considered it for a long moment, staring into his bowl as if the answer lay in the remnants of the stew. Nobody deserves to be left for the buzzards, he said at last, his voice flat. He met her eyes. Saw a woman in trouble. That's all. It wasn't all, she sensed. There was more beneath the surface of his stoic pronouncements, but she didn't press. She owed him her life, she wouldn't pry into his soul. Instead, she found herself telling him, in hesitant, broken sentences, a little of her own story. Not everything, not the raw, terrifying heart of it, but enough. She spoke of a journey west with her husband, David, seeking a new life in Oregon. She spoke of dreams of a small farm, of peace. She didn't speak of the men who had shattered those dreams, not yet. The memory was too fresh, too brutal. Jedediah listened without interruption, his expression unreadable. When she trailed off, her voice thick with unshed tears, he simply nodded. World's a hard place, Eliza, he paused. Lost my wife, Martha, to the fever, 10 years back. Had a small boy too, Samuel. Took him as well, he said it matter-of-factly, but Eliza saw the flicker of profound, unhealed pain in his eyes. It was a brief, startling glimpse into the heart of his own solitude. The shared revelation, however stark, shifted something between them. The silence that followed was less heavy, imbued with a nascent understanding. They were two wounded souls, adrift in a harsh world, who had found a temporary harbor in each other's unexpected company. As Eliza grew stronger, she began to take small steps around the cabin. She helped with minor chores, mending a tear in Jedediah's shirt with a needle and thread he produced from a small tin box, her stitches neat and precise. It was a small act of domesticity, incongruous in the rugged setting, yet it felt right. She learned more about his solitary existence. He hunted, he trapped, he traded furs at a distant outpost once or twice a year. He read his few books over and over. He lived a life pared down to its bare essentials. One evening, as a storm gathered outside, the wind howling like a hungry wolf around the eaves of the cabin, the tension that had been simmering beneath the surface finally broke. Not between them, but from the world beyond. They heard it first as a distant sound, almost lost in the wind, the nicker of horses, too many for a lone rider. Jedediah tensed, his head snapping up. He moved to the cabin's single small, shuttered window, peering out into the gloom. Company, he said, his voice grim. And I don't reckon they're friendly. Eliza's heart leaped into her throat. Fear, cold and sharp, pierced through her. She knew, with a dreadful certainty, who it might be. The men from the trail. The men who had killed David and left her for dead. They must have circled back, looking for her, or perhaps they'd tracked Jedediah. Jedediah moved quickly, his earlier languor gone, replaced by a focused alertness. He checked his rifle, then handed the shotgun to Eliza. You know how to use this, he asked, his eyes boring into hers. She nodded, her hand surprisingly steady as she took the heavy weapon. My father taught me. David hadn't liked guns, but her father, a stern, practical man, had insisted. Good, Jedediah said. Stay away from the door. And don't shoot unless you have to, or unless I tell you. He moved to the door, listening intently. The sound of hooves grew closer, then stopped just outside. A rough voice called out. Hello, the cabin. Anyone home? The tone was deceptively friendly, but a hard edge lay beneath it. Jedediah didn't answer immediately. He looked at Eliza, a silent question in his eyes. She knew what he was asking. Was this them? She gave a tiny, almost imperceptible nod, her face pale but resolute. He turned back to the door. "Who's asking?" he called out, his voice deliberately calm. "Just some riders looking for shelter from the storm," the voice replied. "Maybe a little information. We're looking for a woman. Dark hair, pretty. Might 'a come this way." Eliza's blood ran cold. It was them. Jedediah's eyes met hers again, and in them, she saw not fear, but a grim resolve. He wasn't going to give her up. He was going to protect her. This quiet, solitary man, who owed her nothing, was preparing to stand against armed men for her sake. "Ain't seen no woman like that," Jedediah called back, his voice firm. "And this ain't no inn. Best you move on. Storm's gettin' worse." There was a pause, then a harsh laugh from outside. "Don't reckon you're tellin' us the truth, old man. We got reason to believe she's in there. Why don't you just open the door, and we can all stay friendly?" The threat was unmistakable. Jedediah's jaw tightened. He glanced at Eliza, then back at the door. "I said, move on," he stated, his voice now hard as iron. "This is my land. And you ain't welcome." The fragile peace of the cabin had been shattered. The storm outside raged, mirroring the conflict that was about to erupt. Eliza clutched the shotgun, her knuckles white. She was terrified, but a new feeling was mixing with the fear, a fierce determination. She would not be a victim again. She would stand with this man, this unexpected protector. The rising action had crested, and the midpoint crisis was upon them, forcing a commitment born of shared danger and an unspoken, burgeoning loyalty. The next few moments would decide their fates. The silence that followed Jedediah's defiant words was thick with menace, broken only by the howl of the wind and the nervous stamp of a horse just outside the cabin door. Eliza could feel her heart hammering against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. She watched Jedediah, his stance solid, his rifle held ready but not yet aimed. He was a rock against the storm, both literal and metaphorical. Then, a sudden, brutal kick slammed against the door, making the rough-hewn planks shudder. "Last chance, old man," the voice outside snarled, all pretense of friendliness gone. "Open up, or we're comin' in." Jedediah didn't flinch. "You try that," he said, his voice dangerously low, "and you'll regret it." He shifted his weight, preparing. Another kick, stronger this time, and the wood around the latch splintered. Eliza tensed, her finger tightening on the shotgun's trigger. She could hear muttered curses and the shuffling of men outside. This was it. They weren't going away. "To hell with this," a different voice growled, and then the door burst inward with a crash of splintered wood, torn from its leather hinges. 3 men spilled into the small cabin, their faces harsh and cruel in the flickering firelight, guns already in their hands. They were just as she remembered from that horrific day, brutal, arrogant, reeking of trail dust and malice. Their leader, a burly man with a jagged scar across his cheek, leered when he saw Eliza. "Well, well. What have we here?" he sneered, his eyes glinting. "Looks like our little bird found herself a new nest. And a tough old rooster to guard it." His gaze flicked to Jedediah. "Shoulda just given her up, old man. Woulda been easier on you." Before the men could say more, Jedediah moved. He wasn't young, but he moved with the swift, deadly economy of a man who knew violence. His rifle cracked, the sound deafening in the enclosed space. One of the intruders, who had been raising his pistol, cried out and clutched his shoulder, his gun clattering to the dirt floor. He stumbled back, surprise and pain etched on his face. The scar-faced leader roared in anger and fired, his bullet thudding into the cabin wall perilously close to Jedediah's head. The third man lunged towards Eliza. She didn't hesitate. Her father's lessons, buried deep, surfaced. She brought the shotgun up, aimed, and pulled both triggers. The blast was enormous, filling the cabin with acrid smoke and the smell of gunpowder. The men charging her screamed, a high, thin sound, as the buckshot tore into his leg, sending him sprawling. The cabin was suddenly a chaos of smoke, shouts, and the terrifying thunder of gunfire. Jedediah was grappling with the leader, a desperate, close-quarters struggle. They crashed against the small table, sending bowls and utensils flying. Eliza, her ears ringing, fumbled to reload the shotgun, her hands shaking violently. She saw the first man Jedediah had shot, the one with the wounded shoulder, trying to pick up his fallen pistol with his good hand. "Jedediah, look out," she screamed. Jedediah, locked in a fierce embrace with the leader, couldn't turn. But her warning gave him the split second he needed. He slammed his elbow back into the leader's face, a sickening crunch echoing through the small room. The leader grunted, his grip loosening. Jedediah shoved him away, spinning just as the wounded man raised his pistol. Jedediah's rifle fired again, a precise, deadly shot. The man dropped his gun, his eyes wide with shock, and collapsed. Now it was just the leader, dazed but still dangerous, and the man Eliza had shot, moaning on the floor. The leader shook his head, blood streaming from his broken nose. He snarled, a cornered animal, and lunged for Jedediah again, a long knife suddenly appearing in his hand. Eliza, having managed to reload one barrel of the shotgun, aimed it at the leader's broad back. She couldn't get a clear shot without endangering Jedediah. But Jedediah was ready. As the leader came at him, knife arcing, Jedediah sidestepped with surprising agility and brought the butt of his rifle down hard on the man's wrist. The knife clattered away. With a guttural roar, Jedediah drove his fist into the leader's jaw. The man staggered, his eyes glazing over. Jedediah hit him again, a short, brutal punch, and the leader crumpled to the floor, unconscious. Silence descended, heavy and suffocating, broken only by the whimpers of the man Eliza had shot in the leg and the ragged gasps of Jedediah and Eliza. Smoke stung their eyes and choked their lungs. The air was thick with the metallic scent of blood and spent powder. The storm still raged outside, but inside the small cabin, the immediate, violent tempest had passed. Jedediah stood panting, his rifle still held at the ready, his gaze sweeping the small room. He looked at the two fallen men, then at the unconscious leader. His chest heaved. He turned to Eliza. Her face was pale, smudged with gunpowder, her eyes wide and luminous in the dim light. The shotgun was still clutched in her hands. "You all right?" he rasped, his voice hoarse. Eliza could only nod, a wave of nausea and shock washing over her. Now that the adrenaline was fading, the reality of what had just happened, what she had just done, began to sink in. She had shot a man. She had stood her ground. She had survived. Jedediah moved cautiously towards the men she'd wounded. He was alive, conscious, but in agony. The other two, one was clearly dead, the other, the leader, still breathing but out cold. Jedediah prodded him with his boot. "He'll be out for a while," he looked at Eliza again, a new respect in his eyes. "You did good. Real good." The praise, simple and unadorned, meant more to Eliza than any flowery compliment could have. She had faced her attackers, the source of her deepest trauma, and with Jedediah by her side, she had not broken. A small, fierce spark of something akin to triumph flickered within her, warring with the horror. She had not just been a victim, she had been an agent in her own survival. What do we do now?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. Jedediah surveyed the scene. "First, we make sure they ain't a threat no more." He found rope and efficiently tied up the unconscious leader and the wounded men, despite his groans of protest. Then, he dragged the dead man outside, into the howling storm, leaving him a short distance from the cabin. He would deal with that grim task properly when daylight came and the storm abated. Returning to the cabin, he righted the overturned stool and sank onto it, weariness etched into every line of his body. He looked at Eliza, who was still standing, the shotgun now resting loosely in her grip. "We stood together, Eliza," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "They came for you, but they found both of us. We made our choice." Their commitment, forged in the crucible of that violent confrontation, was now undeniable. They had faced death together and survived. The cabin, once a mere shelter, now felt like a fortress, however small, defended by their shared courage. The immediate threat was neutralized, the climax of their violent encounter passed. The prairie wind continued its lament outside, but within the bloodied, smoky confines of the small sod cabin, a new, unbreakable bond had been sealed. The journey ahead was still uncertain, but they would face it, not as two solitary individuals, but as a united front. The aftermath of the violent confrontation settled upon the small cabin like a shroud. The storm outside gradually subsided, its fury spent, leaving behind a raw, rain-washed world. Inside, the air remained thick with the lingering scent of gunpowder and blood, a grim reminder of the life-and-death struggle that had taken place. Jedediah, his face set in grim lines, methodically cleaned his rifle, his movements precise and economical despite the bone-deep weariness he felt. Eliza sat on the edge of the cot, the shotgun resting beside her, her hands still trembling slightly. The immediate danger had passed, but the shock wave still rippled through her. Jedediah finished with his rifle and looked at the two captives. The leader remained unconscious, his breathing heavy. The man Eliza had shot was moaning softly, his face contorted in pain. "We'll have to decide what to do with them come morning," Jedediah said, his voice flat. "Can't keep them here." He glanced at Eliza, his expression softening almost imperceptibly. "You need to rest. You've been through more than enough." Eliza shook her head. "I don't think I can sleep." The images of the fight, the explosion of the shotgun, the sight of fallen men, replayed relentlessly in her mind. She felt a strange mixture of exhaustion and a hyper-alertness that made sleep impossible. She had taken a life, or at least, grievously wounded a man with the intent to stop him, to protect herself and Jedediah. The weight of it was immense. Jedediah seemed to understand. He didn't press her. Instead, he built up the fire again, the renewed flames casting a more cheerful, though still flickering, light around the small room. He found a tin cup and poured her a little of the whiskey he kept for medicinal purposes, or for nights when the loneliness bit too deep. "Sip this," he said. "Might help." She took the cup, her fingers brushing his. The brief contact sent a small, unexpected jolt through her. She took a tentative sip. The whiskey was harsh, burning its way down her throat, but it did bring a small measure of warmth, a slight dulling of the sharp edges of her shock. They sat in silence for a long time, the only sounds the crackle of the fire and the labored breathing of the captive men. It wasn't an awkward silence anymore, but one filled with unspoken understanding, a shared experience that had bound them together in a way neither could have anticipated. As the first pale light of dawn began to filter through the cracks in the shuttered window, Jedediah rose. "I'll see to, outside," he said, his meaning clear. Eliza nodded, her throat tight. He took a shovel and went out. She didn't watch. She didn't need to. The grim finality of it was something she preferred to keep at a distance, even though she had played her part. When he returned, his face was somber, but his gaze was steady. The leader was beginning to stir, groaning. Jedediah went to him, checked his bonds, then retrieved a canteen of water. He forced a few sips between the man's cracked lips. "You'll live," Jedediah said, his voice devoid of sympathy. Though you might wish you hadn't, he did the same for the man with the wounded leg, who was now fully conscious and glaring at them with a mixture of pain and hatred. "What are you gonna do with us?" Thorne, the leader, whose name they later learned was Marcus Cole, rasped, his voice hoarse. "Haven't decided yet," Jedediah replied coolly. "But leaving you here to cause more trouble ain't an option." He looked at Eliza. "Nearest town with any kind of law is Fort Bridger. That's a good 3 days' ride, maybe more, with prisoners." Eliza considered this. The thought of traveling with these men, even as captives, filled her with dread. But she also knew Jedediah was right. They couldn't just let them go. And she couldn't stay here, not anymore. This isolated cabin, once a sanctuary, now felt tainted by violence. Besides, Cole and his men knew where it was. Even if these two were dealt with, there might be others in their gang. "We can't stay here, Jedediah," she said softly, voicing his unspoken thought. "They know this place." He nodded. "My thoughts exactly." He looked at her, a question in his eyes. "What about you, Eliza? What will you do?" This was the question she had been avoiding. Her original plans, her dreams of Oregon with David, were ashes. She had no destination, no one waiting for her. She was adrift. But looking at Jedediah, this quiet, resilient man who had saved her life and stood by her, an idea began to form, fragile and uncertain, but persistent. I don't know," she began, then hesitated. Perhaps I could travel with you. To Fort Bridger, at least. I wouldn't be a burden. I can cook, mend. I can shoot." As you saw, a faint blush touched her cheeks. Jedediah looked at her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. She thought he might refuse, tell her she was better off on her own, or try to find her passage with a wagon train. But then, a slow smile, a genuinely warm smile this time, spread across his face, crinkling the corners of his eyes. "Reckon I could use the company," he said. "And another pair of hands. Especially with these two in tow." Relief washed over Eliza, so potent it almost buckled her knees. She wasn't alone anymore. She had an ally, a protector, perhaps even a friend. A new path was opening up, unexpected and daunting, but not one she would have to walk by herself. They spent the day preparing for the journey. Jedediah had a sturdy pack mule in a small, hidden corral behind the cabin. They loaded it with their meager supplies, food, water, ammunition, a few blankets. Jedediah fashioned a crude splint for the wounded man's leg, making it clear that any attempt to escape would be met with swift and severe consequences. Cole, the leader, remained sullen and defiant, but the fight had clearly been knocked out of him, at least for now. As evening approached, a sense of quiet purpose filled the small cabin. The horrific events of the previous night were still a raw wound, but the shared decision to leave, to move forward together, had brought a sense of clarity. They ate a simple meal, the two prisoners bound, and watched closely. Eliza found herself less afraid, more resolute. The experience had changed her, stripping away layers of fear and uncertainty, revealing an inner strength she hadn't known she possessed. Later, as Jedediah checked the lashings on the pack mule one last time by the light of a lantern, Eliza stood beside him, watching the stars begin to prick the darkening sky. The air was cool and clean. "Thank you, Jedediah," she said softly, her voice filled with an emotion that went deeper than simple gratitude. "For everything. For believing in me, for not leaving me." He turned, his silhouette dark against the twilight. He reached out, his calloused hand gently touching her arm. It was a simple gesture, yet it spoke volumes. "We look out for each other now, Eliza," he said, his voice a low rumble. "That's how it is." His touch lingered for a moment, a spark of warmth in the cool night air. It was a touch that acknowledged their shared ordeal, their budding trust, and the unspoken promise of the journey ahead. A new normal was beginning to establish itself, born from violence and loss, but tempered with courage and a fragile, growing connection. They were no longer just a man and a woman thrown together by chance, but partners, bound by the blood they had almost shed and the future they had chosen to face side by side. The path to Fort Bridger would be long and undoubtedly dangerous, but as Eliza looked at Jedediah's strong, quiet profile, she felt a flicker of something she hadn't felt in a very long time: hope. The journey to Fort Bridger was arduous, fraught with unspoken tensions and the constant vigilance required when escorting dangerous prisoners. Jedediah set a relentless pace, pushing them from before dawn until well after dusk, wanting to put as much distance as possible between them and his now compromised cabin. Eliza, though still recovering, matched his stride, her resilience hardening with each mile they covered. She rode Bess, while Jedediah walked, leading the pack mule on which Cole and the other outlaw, a surly man named Pike whose leg was crudely splinted, were securely tied, back to back. Days blurred into a routine of dusty trails, meager meals cooked over small, smokeless fires, and watchful nights. Jedediah and Eliza took turns standing guard, though neither slept deeply. The presence of their captives was a constant, simmering threat. Cole remained defiant, occasionally spitting insults or veiled threats, while Pike mostly groaned and cursed his throbbing leg. Jedediah met their hostility with a stony silence that seemed to unnerve them more than any angry retort would have. During the long hours on the trail, a quiet companionship grew between Jedediah and Eliza. They spoke little, their communication often consisting of shared glances, nods, or brief, practical exchanges. Yet, in that sparsity of words, a deeper understanding flourished. Eliza learned to read the subtle shifts in Jedediah's posture, the tightening of his jaw that signaled unease, or the rare, almost imperceptible softening around his eyes when he looked at a particularly beautiful sunset. He, in turn, saw her quiet determination, the way she never complained despite the hardships, the way her hands, though often trembling with exhaustion, remained capable and sure as she tended to their camp chores or checked the perimeter. One evening, camped in a small, sheltered canyon, after they had eaten their usual spare meal of jerky and hardtack, Eliza found Jedediah staring into the flames, his expression distant and melancholic. The prisoners were secured for the night, their grumblings having finally subsided into uneasy sleep. "What are you thinking about?" Eliza asked softly, settling beside him, careful not to startle him. He was silent for a long moment, then sighed, a sound that seemed to carry the weight of years. Just things, he said vaguely. Then, surprisingly, he elaborated. Thinking about Martha. And Samuel. Sometimes, out here, under all these stars, it's like I can almost feel them close. He paused. It's been a long time since I let myself think on it too much. Eliza's heart ached for him. She understood that particular brand of grief, the kind that never truly faded but became a part of the landscape of one's soul. David, my husband, he loved the stars, she said, her own voice quiet. He used to say they were reminders that there was something bigger than us, something beautiful and constant, even when everything else felt like it was falling apart. Jedediah looked at her, a flicker of shared sorrow and understanding in his eyes. He sounds like he was a good man. He was, Eliza affirmed, a bittersweet ache in her chest. He deserved better than what he got. Most folks do, Jedediah said gruffly, but there was no harshness in his tone. He reached out, almost hesitantly, and his fingers briefly brushed hers where they rested on the ground between them. It was a fleeting touch, yet it conveyed a depth of empathy that words could not. We carry them with us, Eliza. That's all we can do. Carry them, and keep going. That shared moment of vulnerability deepened their bond significantly. It was a quiet confession of past pains, an acknowledgement of the ghosts they both carried. From that night on, the silences between them felt less like empty spaces and more like comfortable rooms, shared and understood. Eliza began to see beyond Jedediah's stoic exterior to the decent, honorable man beneath, a man scarred by loss but not broken by it. And Jedediah, who had lived in self-imposed isolation for so long, found himself slowly, cautiously, opening up to the warmth of Eliza's presence, her quiet strength, her resilient spirit. They reached the outskirts of Fort Bridger on the fifth day, a sprawling, bustling outpost that seemed like a metropolis after weeks in the wilderness. The sight of so many people, the noise, the activity, was almost overwhelming to Eliza. Jedediah, however, navigated it with a practiced ease. He located the marshal's office, a small, sturdy log building near the center of the fort. Marshal Thompson was a stern, weathered man with eyes that missed nothing. He listened impassively as Jedediah recounted their story, his gaze occasionally flicking to Eliza, then to the two sullen prisoners. He examined Pike's wound, then Cole's bruised face, with a professional detachment. These two, Cole and Pike, they're part of the Rollins gang, Marshal Thompson stated, his voice gravelly. Been wanted for robbery and murder across 3 territories. You did a good service bringing them in, Thorne. And you, ma'am, he said, nodding respectfully to Eliza, you showed remarkable courage. Hearing the marshal confirm the identity of her attackers, knowing they were notorious criminals, sent a chill down Eliza's spine, but also a strange sense of validation. Her ordeal hadn't been a random act of cruelty, it had been at the hands of hardened outlaws. And she had survived them. With Cole and Pike securely locked away in the fort's small jail, a palpable sense of relief settled over Jedediah and Eliza. The immediate threat that had propelled their journey was finally over. They found lodging at a modest boarding house, clean but basic. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, Eliza slept in a real bed, under a roof that wasn't made of sod, without the need to keep one ear open for danger. The next morning, after a breakfast that felt luxurious compared to their trail rations, Jedediah found Eliza sitting on the boarding house porch, looking out at the busy thoroughfare. Marshall says there's a wagon train heading west in a few days, he said, his voice carefully neutral. Thought you might want to know. They're bound for Oregon. Oregon. The word hung in the air between them. It was the dream she had shared with David, the destination that now felt like a lifetime away, part of a life that no longer existed. She looked at Jedediah, at his strong, kind face, his steady eyes. The thought of leaving him, of continuing her journey alone, filled her with an unexpected pang of desolation. And you, Jedediah, she asked. What will you do? He shrugged, looking out at the distant mountains. Don't rightly know. My cabin, it ain't safe there anymore. Reckon I'll have to find a new place. Start over. Again there was a weariness in his voice that tugged at her heart. An idea, bold and perhaps foolish, took root in Eliza's mind. She thought of the resilience they had found together, the trust they had built, the unspoken understanding that had grown between them. She thought of his loneliness and her own. Jedediah, she began, her voice a little unsteady, what if you didn't have to start over alone? He turned to look at her, surprise and something else, a flicker of hope in his eyes. What if we found a new place together? Built something new? Not like before, she added hastily, a blush rising on her cheeks, but as partners. Friends. He stared at her, speechless for a long moment. The bustling sounds of Fort Bridger seemed to fade away. Then, slowly, the lines around his eyes softened, and that rare, warm smile touched his lips. Eliza Carter, he said, his voice filled with a gentle wonder, are you proposing we become homesteaders together? Maybe I am, she said, a shy smile playing on her own lips. We've faced down outlaws. Surely, we can face down a patch of stubborn land. He chuckled, a low, rumbling sound that sent a shiver of warmth through her. Reckon we could at that. He reached out and took her hand, his grip firm and reassuring. I'd like that, Eliza. I'd like that very much. In that moment, standing on the porch of a boarding house in a dusty frontier town, a new dream began to take shape, not born of past sorrows, but forged in shared hardship and mutual respect. The journey had been epic, born of violence and desperation, but it had led them here, to this quiet moment of decision, to this hopeful new beginning. The scars of their pasts would always remain, but now, they would not have to bear them alone. They had found in each other an anchor, a companion, a reason to look towards the future not with dread, but with a resilient, burgeoning hope. The prairie was vast, and life would undoubtedly bring more challenges, but together, they felt ready to face whatever came their way. Not every family is born of blood. Some are chosen, forged in fire, and bound by the unbreakable ties of shared survival and quiet, enduring affection. Thank you for listening to Jedediah and Eliza's story. Their journey reminds us that even in the deepest despair, connection and courage can light the way. If you've ever found strength in an unexpected place, or discovered family in someone who was once a stranger, this story speaks to that truth. We believe that true family is something we find and something we build, often in the most surprising of circumstances. What would you do to protect those you come to care for? Do you believe that hope can truly blossom even after the harshest storms of life? Tell us your thoughts in the comments below. We love hearing from you. If this story touched your heart, please leave a like, share it with others who might find solace or inspiration in it, and don't forget to subscribe to Channel Name Placeholder for more tales of resilience, connection, and the enduring power of the human spirit. There are so many truths left to tell, so many journeys to share. Until next time, take care.